Thank you for joining us for this web event today. My name is Erica Lundahl. I'm the Conservation Impact Manager for Mountaineers Books and for Braided River. We'd like to begin this event by recognizing that the Salish Sea region is the traditional and present-day homelands of many indigenous peoples and tribal nations. And we'd like to acknowledge the place-based knowledge of these people and are grateful for their ancestral and current stewardship of these lands. Wherever you are, we invite you to learn about what tribal land you're living on, the treaties of that land and people, and to consider your place in respecting and upholding tribal treaty rights. We'd also like to acknowledge the ongoing systemic oppression and violence of Black lives, and as we hold this dialogue today, and this web event invites you to consider how environmental justice and racial justice are interconnected. Today's presentation is Orca Health 2020, a We Are Puget Sound event, and is part of our We Are Puget Sound campaign, which is currently sharing actions and resources to empower community care for our Salish Sea, its people, wildlife, waters, and lands. And June is Orca Month. Today we'll hear from several members of the Orca Recovery Task Force who are instrumental in developing a suite of recommendations for action for the recovery of the southern resident orca population. Speakers will be providing an update on the status of those recommendations, and we'll learn which actions are being implemented, which actions are showing signs of effectiveness, and which ones aren't. They'll provide opportunities for what we can do as individuals and collectively to improve the waters for the iconic southern resident orcas. We Are Puget Sound was created in partnership with Washington Environmental Council, and we thank all of our presenters for being here today. Today's presentation is going to last about 50 minutes and will be followed with some questions and answers. You can ask a question anytime during the presentation by using the question box that you can see on the right hand of your screen, or sometimes it's right underneath at the bottom of your screen. We'll save your questions for our panelists to answer right after they have finished presenting. So let's get started. Mindy, I'm going to hand the reins over to you.
All right, thank you. Thank you very much, Erica, and thanks everyone for joining us today. My name is Mindy Roberts, and I lead the Puget Sound program here at Washington Environmental Council. And thank you, Erica, for acknowledging the lands that we're on and also the societal questions that we're all asking ourselves. And I know as a white person, I'm working on my role in systemic racism. So thank you for that invitation, Erica. I wanted to start by talking a little bit about We Are Puget Sound, and just to ground us a bit. We're so fortunate to live in this amazing place, Puget Sound in the larger Salish Sea, which begins at the crest of the Cascade Mountains and the Olympic Mountains as well. And those mountains are home to pretty amazing and adorable creatures like the pika, but it's also a place of people. And I think as we've all been dealing in our own way with the coronavirus, public health pandemic, finding ways of spending time outside for our own mental health has been very important to people. But our region is really defined by water, and that's water that sustains the evergreen forests around us, that finds its way into these amazing rivers and streams that then give life. And that life includes salmon. Salmon have sustained people from time immemorial. But the salmon today have declined, and they've declined to the point where they're impacting communities and they're impacting orcas as well. And part of that decline is because of the changes that we've made around us in the Puget Sound in the Salish Sea region, and changes that we intend to be benefits to us, but they've had some unintended consequences in damaging habitat and creating pollution. Fortunately, there is a huge number of inspiring people who are doing amazing work in their communities to really leave a legacy for all of us in the future. We're very fortunate to have their work and invite you to explore their stories on We Are Puget Sound. And We Are Puget Sound is a campaign. It's about connecting people. It's about connecting people to each other and also connecting people to this place. And again, our goal is we need to leave a legacy for future generations. We cannot be kicking these problems down the road for other people to address in the future. That's just not fair. So with that, that's a bit more about We Are Puget Sound. I invite you to find our website and you can find a little bit more about the campaign, but I did want to switch and talk a bit about the orcas, which is what you joined us here for today. And today I'll use the term orca. Southern resident killer whale is the formal name, but I do refer them to orcas, but know that I'm talking about the southern residents. As Erica mentioned, I served on the Orca Recovery Task Force, and today I am presenting to you my own perspectives in here. I'm in no way representing the entire task force or other members of the task force. But the number of southern residents declined precipitously from what we think were maybe on the order of a few hundred animals to only 71 animals that remained after the orca capture era stopped in 1976. It's hard to believe that was only 1976. And after we stopped catching them, their numbers did begin to rebound up to a peak of 98 animals in 1995. But since that time, their numbers have declined. Southern residents are listed as endangered, but their food, Chinook salmon, is also listed as endangered as well. And as those numbers declined, Governor Inslee established the Orca Task Force to make recommendations on what we need for orca survival and recovery. In a nutshell, the orcas are starving. They don't have enough food. And when orcas go hungry, that means that the pollution and contaminants that they store in their own bodies because of the food that they eat, the pollution is released into the rest of their bodies where it is at levels that can cause harm to their reproductive systems and to their immune systems as well. And the Salish Sea region is a busy, busy place. And it turns out that there's too much noise and disturbance from vessels, including just the mere presence of vessels like kayaks, limits the amount of time that the southern residents spend foraging for salmon. And these animals simply can't miss another meal. So all three of those threats need to be addressed for southern residents to survive and to recover in the future. And partly that's why the breadth of those threats is why there were nearly 50 people appointed to the task force itself. But that doesn't even include the hundreds of people who participated in the work groups, and literally tens of thousands of people took the time to put in comments on what was needed for orca recovery. So it was a huge, huge effort that culminated in the final report last November of 2019. So let's talk a bit about those 49 actions. There was talk early on about, can we just identify a few actions that we can really sink our teeth into and make a difference on? And this list is particularly long. 49 actions is a huge number of things that need to go right, but the list is long because the need is that great. So I just want to give you a little bit of an overview of what those recovery actions are. There are 16 actions that are aimed at increasing the salmon that are available for southern resident orcas. There are another 13 actions that were identified to decrease noise and disturbance. Another 9 actions to decrease the pollution that impacts orcas and their prey. Another 5 actions for funding the work that we need to do, monitoring progress over time, but also adapting the plan as we learn new things over time. 5 actions address climate change, which we know needs to be done for multiple reasons, and orcas is yet another reason. And then finally, there was 1 action that acknowledged that it turns out there are millions of people who will be calling this place home in coming decades. And we know we need to do more today to plan for that growth. How we do that is going to be a really important discussion. So that's a little bit more about the actions in the Orca Task Force. I will be introducing 2 different speakers today, and then I'll come back and talk a bit more about the reporting on how we're doing on those particular actions. So first up, I wanted to introduce Representative Lekanoff. Representative Lekanoff was elected in 2018 and is currently the only Native American serving in the Washington legislature. She is the vice chair of the Environment and Energy Committee and sits on the Capital Budget and Rural Development, Agriculture, and Natural Resources committees. She's a champion for many of these causes, and she is ready to work hard for a better future for the next 7 generations in the upcoming biennium. Over to you, Representative Lekanoff.
Thank you, Mindy. It's so wonderful to see you. And I'm excited to hear from Nora and Amy. Both have been champions in working on environmental issues across Washington state. Thank you for allowing me to participate. All of the work that you are all doing out there is so critically important, and we have to work together to make sure that our lives today and for generations to come can call the wonderful Salish Sea home. I'm excited to collaborate with all of you. My kitchen table down at the state legislature always has a seat for my environmental community. It has a seat for my tribal members. It has a seat for my stakeholders. It has a seat for my citizens, and it has a seat for the governor's office, my legislative colleagues, my congressional colleagues. Many of you know me, and I set a table that includes all of the people that carry a voice who want to make this place special for everyone. And as a state legislature, I am reminded of that every day, that the decisions I'm making are not only going to impact my daughter, but they're going to impact my daughter's daughter, just as it's going to impact your children's children. It's not only do we want to sustain the $6 billion economic revenue that contributes to Washington state, but we want to remind ourselves that the $6 million revenue of natural resources, a clean and healthy environment that provides a sustainable lifeway for commercial fishermen and harvesters, that sustains a lifeway and an obligation for our Coast Salish and our Makah people, whom we have a treaty resource responsibility to, whom we have a responsibility to provide and protect their inherent rights as the first Washingtonians and the first Americans of this great place that we all call home. I want to remind ourselves that the $6 billion economic revenue really relies upon the important and healthy resource of the salmon. The great Randy Kinley from Lummi taught me something very young. I was in my early 30s. I'd come to work for the Swinomish tribe. Randy was a natural resource director for Lummi Nation. And he said, Debra, you are like me. We're people of the salmon. We're salmon people. We have to remember, if you have a healthy salmon, pretend this being a salmon, we'll have a healthy economy. All the people will be healthy. We'll have healthy bodies. The water will be clean. The environment will be clean. Washington state will be made whole if we have a healthy salmon. And that's been my platform as I work in the state legislature. My job has been to be able to sit down with my colleagues and say, oh, my mighty partner sitting around my table, we must be responsible to a healthy and clean environment. We must look to salmon recovery to be one of our primary goals. And my colleagues on the Republican side and my colleagues on the Democratic side, they realize, like me, salmon doesn't recognize whether we're a Democrat or a Republican. They just want to know that we're taking care of their interests. Salmon just want to know that they are going to have a home to come home to. Because as you know, for the past 150 years, our salmon have been fighting to come home. They too are homeless. It's been incredible for me to be able to carry an important dialogue that many of you have been carrying on your backs as long as I've known many of you. And that's making sure that we bring habitat back, that we bring cool and clean water back, that we understand what the word net ecological gain means. This last year, I had the incredible opportunity to sit down with cities and counties, my environmental community, my champions, the agencies, WDFW, Department of Ecology, Department of Health, the incredible staff in the governor's office, and say, how do we engage on net ecological gain? What is that definition? How do we embrace it? How do we take on the conversation of the takings rule? How do we help change our community, our stakeholders, our industries, our businesses, our labor unions, our governing bodies, local, state, and tribal and international, to say, we need to give habitat back. If you close your eyes and think of this, Washington is growing. Our population numbers are going up. Land use is going up. Climate change and environmental impacts, the lines are going up. Habitat is staying flatline. And salmon populations are declining. If we're to raise that number of salmon habitat, we need to increase that flatline habitat to also raise with it. And it's going to take all of us to do that. It's going to take important legislative action items such as integrating salmon recovery into building a sustainable Washington state by green infrastructure, green buildings and businesses and industrial practices. Thank you, Beth Dolio, coming out of the Environmental and Energy Committee, for reminding me that. Is addressing climate change. Thank you, Representative Fitzgibbon, for walking us through that fight. You know, I'm excited to talk about incorporating resilient regulation and permitting that will reflect a new way of doing business in Washington state. We understand in a recession that infrastructure is often the conversation we have. We need to be building, we need to build roads, bridges, culverts, green culverts. But if we're going to build it, we're going to build it green and we're going to build it right. If we're going to streamline our permitting, we're going to streamline it not on the backs of the environment, but to lift the environment up. So I'm excited to build a cleaner and stronger future for our children. And I'm excited to be able to restore a home for our salmon so that we won't have our salmon searching for a home for the next 100 years as they have for the last 150 years. So I want to talk about our orcas. You know, this year, my colleagues in the state legislature, both in the Senate and the House, we really took on an environmental and energy 2019 and 20, running bills that were going to reflect the protection of the mighty orcas. House Bill 1194, toxic pollution. And again, I champion this with Representative Dolio and Representative Shoemake. We took hard conversations with our stakeholders and said, it's time for us to be able to work with the Department of Ecology to be able to look at how do we identify and prioritize chemicals in the beginning of 2020. This bill authorizes ecology to require manufacturer disclosure on the use of priority chemicals and regulate priority consumer products, including restricting or prohibiting manufacturing, sale, or use. Again, it's bills like this that intersect across different issues. Toxic pollution could affect permitting process, recreational activities, salmon health, and our own public health. And I'll continue to support and advocate for similar policies in the next session. I also sponsored legislation to improve the safety of oil transportation and to prevent spills, and that was House Bill 1578. In my 15 years of working on vessel traffic within the Salish Sea, I had the opportunity to work with Department of Ecology, Dale Hansen, to understand what oil spill response is for Washington State, knowing my role as a state legislator, working with stakeholders in the tug and in the safety areas to understand what they're doing and hearing them say, we want to do better. We want to do better. Hearing industry exploring how they can do that. I had the incredible pleasure of working with British Columbia First Nations and Washington tribes on understanding, you know, where is vessel traffic impacting the Salish Sea? And then to be able to look at Department of Ecology and pass a proviso this last in 2019 that says, I want to look at a marine spatial planning and understand how much more vessel traffic can the Salish Sea take? What is our transportation capacity? What is our capacity that we're actually need to consider at the local and federal level? When is enough on the Salish Sea? When are the salmon going to say enough is enough? And how do I do that based on policy, science, and legal and judicial authority? So international relationships are really important. Many of you have heard me talk about the GMA, the Growth Management Act. It is going to be a big issue, not in one session, but in many sessions. How do we strategically build that effort and build regulations and build policies and build programs that work with our stakeholders to be able to implement that in a good way? We don't want to stop building and growth. We want to grow it well. We want to grow it smart. We want to grow it green, and we want to grow it on the very hearts of our children's children yet to come who want to live here. We want them to know that when we built Washington and we did reform to the Growth Management Act, that we did it in a manner that reflected the values of where Washingtonians want to be. So I'm really excited to be able to collaborate with Representative Fitzgibbon on what that's going to look like And I'm looking forward to partnering with my colleagues on identifying long-term session-by-session growth of how we do that collectively together. Again, all the stakeholders at the table working hand in hand. My next upcoming interim plans is actually building what the bucket list is going to look like for salmon recovery being incorporated into the Growth Management Act, and how do we give back to the salmon what they've given to us. And that's a great quality and a healthy way of life. Now, I'm going to be quite frank with all of you. We know that we're addressing a COVID pandemic across the nation, across the world, but even here home in our backyards. We need to be able to look at salmon recovery and find ways to be able to protect that funding, those programs, and that policy within this state legislature, both in the near term and in the long term. Our funding is being detrimentally impacted, and we want to be able to say, how do we better? How do we do it well? How do we protect the funding? But how do we do that with all of you? So I appreciate your time here today. I appreciate you walking hand in hand with me. And please remember, when you come knock at my door in the state legislature, I get to be the one that opens the door and says, hey, Mindy, what can I do for you? And how are we going to collaborate? And how are we going to save the salmon and create a healthy place for all? So thanks, Mindy, for giving me this time.
Thank you, Representative Lekanoff. And for those of you keeping score, the toxics reduction was the Orca Task Force recommendation number 30. Oil transportation and safety was recommendation number 24. And the recommendation related to future growth is number 48. So thank you for sharing progress on that. After the task force sunsetted, how do we implement those recommendations? Next up, I'd like to introduce Amy Windrope, who is the Deputy Director of the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife. She also served on the Southern Resident Killer Whale Task Force and was a champion of increased prey for Southern residents by improving habitat, increasing hatchery production, and limiting disturbance on the water. Amy is an active celebrator of Puget Sound and can be found shucking oysters, pulling crab, and sailing amongst the waves. So over to you, Amy.
All right. Thanks, Mindy. It is such a pleasure to be able to be on this webinar with Representative Lekanoff. She's an inspiring speaker, and she certainly inspires me to action. So thank you, Representative, for all your work on this. You know, Mindy, as you were thinking, as I heard you speaking just then about, you know, keeping score on the scorecard, I was thinking, you know, we could have had a bingo, because I'm going to start listing a bunch of actions, and people could have kept track at home, and maybe we could have made a game of it next time. I also want to appreciate the governor, his leadership on recovering the orca, the governor's salmon recovery office, my sister agencies, the Puget Sound Partnership, the Ecology, Washington Department of Transport. Without us all pulling together, and that includes the citizens of Washington as well as all the state agencies, we just aren't going to get there. So appreciation to them, and a call to all of us to stay focused in this moment of COVID and in this moment of you know, frankly, just a bit of despair in our world. And I hope that the orcas continue to show us a path forward of light, because they really are an extraordinary species, and we do have this opportunity to recover them. So I'm going to share my screen, and we're going to see how this works. Hopefully this will work beautifully. Okay, let's see. Okay. Okay, Mindy, how does that look?
It looks great.
Okay, great. Okay, so the Department of Fish and Wildlife, you know, we have a portfolio of actions that we can take on behalf of the orca. And that was really the priorities that we brought to the task force, was this suite of things that are sort of in our bailiwick. And that's really about prey availability. It's about addressing disturbance and noise, protecting and restoring habitat, and then looking for ongoing funding for implementation, not just at the Department of Fish and Wildlife, but again, with our sister agencies. So I'm going to just jump right into it. So one of the most important things that the orcas need is fish. They need food to eat. One of the calls in the Orca Task Force was we need to increase the prey availability. And there are lots of tools to do this, but the most immediate tool, well, not the most immediate, but one of the immediate tools that we have is increasing hatchery production. So we've increased hatchery production in the 2019 brood year by about 26 million fish. This is a big increase, and we did this in a way that tried to target the salmon coming out that the orca needed, because orca need different fish at different places, and they take advantage of different fish in different places. So we tried to target that. We also wanted to target the increased prey in such a way that we didn't impact the recovery of wild salmon, because there is a tension between wild salmon and hatchery salmon, and we wanted to be mindful of that as we increased the overall production for orcas. Now, those fish that went out in 2019 and that will be going out this year, they live in the ocean for about 3 to 5 years, the Chinook do, before they come back. And we are being helped right now with some, well, cautiously optimistic, moving in the right direction, ocean conditions. So I spoke yesterday with one of our experts at the department, Marissa Litz, who helped me understand what was going on with the ocean conditions. And what we see is that on the river side, so that's for the smolts leaving the system as they're headed out. What we see is that snowpack is at normal, about 100% of normal. We see a cool spring on the east side and the west side, keeping the water temperatures cool in the rivers. The blob that used to sit off our coast has dissipated. Upwelling is within the range of normal. So the upwelling actually brings the phytoplankton to the surface and allows it to be available for out-migrating smolts. And what we see is that in some work that NOAA's doing is that we see that in the trawls that they're doing off our coast, that they're seeing normal cool water species. So for out-migrating salmon, we see that we're cautiously optimistic that they're going to be going into a system that is positive for them. Now, in terms of the adults coming back this year, the adults that are coming back this year left those rivers in 2015 and 2017. And you all may remember in 2015 that we had one of the most significant droughts in Washington. Those salmon that left in 2015 have struggled in the ocean. They had the blob to get through, they had unfavorable ocean conditions. So we know that this coming year that we are going to see low Chinook returns. And because of that, our fisheries have been greatly constrained. The ocean conditions we think are going to be moving in the positive direction, but we are continuing to monitor it. And we're also looking at how we can understand our fisheries to make sure that we are managing the fisheries in a way that doesn't impact the southern residents. The next piece about making prey available for the salmon is making sure that they can find them in the water. So when those adults are coming back, can the orcas find them through echolocation? Do they have less disturbance? So in the last year, moving into this season, this summer, we've increased our education outreach, and that really is about working with Soundwatch and other folks on the water, as well as with Department of Fish and Wildlife Enforcement Police. We've increased enforcement patrols out on the water to make sure that the orcas have as much quiet as we can give them. We were also directed by the legislature to begin a new project or a new license, a commercial whale watching license. And this license is going to regulate a number of boats that can be around the orca, the amount of time they can spend around the orca, how much of the percent of the day, where they can be. So we have an opportunity here to have long-term accountability into the future and making sure that the commercial whale watching industry, which is such a force for positive conservation, continues to operate in a way that is supportive of orca recovery. And I just want to acknowledge at this moment that, our whale watching community has taken a really significant hit with the loss of tourism and the COVID-19 issues. And my heart goes out to those folks. And I'm hoping that, as we all recover, that industry, which is such an important industry, honestly, for educating people about orca, can recover as well. And that we do this in a way that works for the orcas. Now I want to talk a little bit about habitat. And Representative Lekanoff spoke to this a little bit as well. We are all recognizing that our current status of how we protect the ecosystem is based on the Growth Management Act, the Shoreline Management Act, hydraulic permit authorities. We have this sort of patchwork of authorities that protect the environment of Washington and maintains the incredible high quality of life we have here. But what we're seeing is that all of those legislative mandates use something called no net loss, which means that we want to essentially maintain what we have right now. But the reality is that we acknowledge that what we have right now has led us to the decline of orca and has led us to the decline of salmon. So we are working together with the communities, with our building partners, with other state agencies, with Representative Lekanoff and other representatives to actually begin to think about no net loss doesn't get us there. What about net ecological gain? How do we actually acknowledge this population upsurge that we're going to be seeing in the coming years and improve the ecological condition? Because we cannot recover the salmon by simply not having additional loss. Our salmon need, the salmon touch everything that we do. I just want to say that, like, it's, there's no activity that humans do in Puget Sound that doesn't in some direct or indirect way eventually touch our salmon and therefore our orca. So the Department of Fish and Wildlife has been working on multiple efforts around habitat. So part of it is about, we received additional authorities to better protect shorelines. We received additional money to understand how our shorelines feed the bottom of the food chain and the forage fish. And we are working together to improve compliance and to make sure that folks do the right thing on the shorelines. We're also working to restore important areas, habitats, estuarine habitats, as well as riverine habitats throughout the state, but in Puget Sound in particular. The Department of Fish and Wildlife this last fall, maybe more like winter by the time we got the work done, actually implemented one of the largest estuary restoration projects that we've seen in Puget Sound since the Nisqually Delta. We are also working on removing fish barriers, inventory, the barriers that are most important for the orca, and starting to put our energies so that they can synergistically work together with the estuary restoration, the salmon berries, the riverine restoration. We're also improving management of dams to reduce impacts on salmon. And I'm not speaking, I'm gonna sort of not speak to the piece about the Snake River dams, but speaking about the Columbia River dams, we have essentially changed the way the water flows over the dams for the benefit of salmon, which of course then benefit the orca. Finally, so we have, orca, salmon are delicious, not just to humans and orcas, but of course to other fish. So one of the challenges that we have is to reduce the predation of salmon by non-native fish. And so this includes fish that live in our lakes. This is fish that live in Columbia River. And so we are trying to find ways to either eradicate, in the instance of the northern pike, or increase the amount of fishing on these non-native fish so that we have more salmon able to leave our streams. Now, in terms of the adults coming back, we know that seals and sea lions, they are a significant consumer of salmon on the way back. And we are doing work in Puget Sound, cross-boundary work with Canada and with our tribal co-managers to look at what is the impact, what is the ecological impact of the increase in the harbor seal population, in particular in Puget Sound, and what does that mean for the salmon moving forward? And then in the Columbia River, we have also increased our deterrents to make sure that we get more adult salmon through the dams. So those are where we're at right now. There's a lot of work happening throughout Puget Sound, not just at the department, but throughout the different agencies. I also want to acknowledge our tribal co-managers. They are part and parcel of this solution, and they are bringing not only their expertise, but their historical ancestral knowledge to the table. So just to wrap it up, a couple of things that we've got to call to action for folks. One is we need to protect the existing actions that we have for Southern residents and continue to support funding for it. We've got the Whale Watch licensing program. We'll be coming in front of the commission in December. And then I encourage everyone to get out and experience Puget Sound and the Columbia River. And one of the best ways to do that is to go to our website and check it out and see if you can just get out there more, because that's one of the best things in the world. And I will stop there, Mindy.
Great, thank you so much, Amy. Appreciate that. And you touched on I won't name the numbers, but a lot of them in the salmon recommendations, some in the vessel recommendations, and then also just how are we going to address future growth. So thanks for your time. And if you haven't already done so, please use our Q&A and pose some questions to all of our panelists. So what I wanted to do now is go back to sharing my screen and doing that at the same time I'm talking, which is dangerous. Okay. Again, I mentioned at the beginning, I'd like to talk about, well, how are we doing on all of these? And again, a strong caveat that these are my perceptions as an individual and are not reflective of the full task force or any other members of the task force itself. And I do hope we get an opportunity to do this more comprehensively, but just for today's purpose, wanted to give people a snapshot of how we see things. If you see things differently, we'd love to talk more about what we're missing maybe in this report card. But overall, about 6 of the actions that are recommended by the task force are substantially done or underway or near completion overall. Another 8 of them are underway. They're either on track for where they should be, maybe not yet complete, or are substantially done, but maybe not all the way done as the task force intended. There are 2 open public processes right now. Amy mentioned the Whale Watch licensing system. Number 18 is there's public process underway there. Number 39 is decreasing nutrient and other pollution from wastewater in Puget Sound. That's another open public process. If you're interested in either of those, please reach out to me and we'd love to talk about with you more on those. So too soon to tell whether those will get to the level that the Orca Task Force recommended. But that does leave another 33 actions that are not yet started, or maybe were started, but with the current economic crisis, had to be rethought, at least at this point. So this is not to say that we recognize there's a lot of work that is needed to be done. You just heard from 2 people who are doing a lot to implement these recommendations. We need more people helping us with this. So I did want to start with acknowledging, as Amy mentioned, the economic crisis, but our society today is facing this amazing combination of crises, including the coronavirus public health crisis. We're seeing the crisis of systemic racism against Black people as well, and then the economic impacts to the private sector, to the public sector, and really to everybody. And as we will be asking hard questions on all of these issues, we can't duck any of these issues. They all have to be addressed somehow, and that is particularly difficult. And just a note too, that as we talk about the salmon recommendations, the lack of salmon has harmed people, and that includes tribes and indigenous people. Salmon is food security and something that people are talking about more and more these days. So the loss of salmon is the loss of food security for these communities. And food security was the heart of the treaties that they signed with the US government in the 1800s. So when we talk about things like habitat protections, it is for protections for salmon, but it's also protections for people as well. Secondly, toxic pollution. You heard earlier from Representative Lekanoff. One, toxic pollution harms people as well. And we know that communities with higher proportions of people of color are disproportionately impacted by toxic pollution. And that has economic impacts as well at the community. So keeping toxics out of consumer products helps people, and it helps orcas as well. So this is all to say that sometimes the same actions are helpful for all of these, and the same actions are helping people as well as orcas. But we are just literally running out of time, and we're at this crisis point also with salmon, and we know that they're only going to compound over time. So overall, we just need to do better on implementing these actions and figuring out very innovative ways to do this today. I did want to mention that just yesterday there was an action that was announced. Attorney General Ferguson announced a settlement with Monsanto related to PCB contamination. That was also a recommendation of the task force. So additional money will be coming into the general fund, and we would just urge the legislature to think about the $95 million is there to reduce PCB contamination, which definitely impacts people and also orcas as well, but it goes to the general fund, and it's going to be awfully tempting, especially with the economic crisis, to tap into that. So we need to be mindful that that goes to where it was intended. So and then you're going to hear about in just a moment from my colleague Nora Nickham from the Seattle Aquarium, an action that you can take related to recommendation number 25. So in terms of what you can do right now, there are a lot of asks out there, and we need to start with systemic racism. We need to address the public health crisis. To the extent that you have capacity and can engage in these issues, we invite you to join us also with the We Are Puget Sound campaign. Join us through social media and also get involved with us for the actions that we're recommending. So the 10 actions that you can take include things like voting. We have a primary election that's coming up in August, and in fact, you'll start getting your ballots in the next couple weeks. So voting is incredibly important, and everyone needs to take the time to vote. So with that, I'm going to introduce my colleague, Nora. She's going to tell you a bit more about another action once I stop sharing my screen. Nora Nickum is the Ocean Policy Manager at the Seattle Aquarium. In her work prior to joining the team at the aquarium, including serving as project manager for the Governor's Southern Resident Orca Recovery Task Force, which is where many of us met Nora for the first time, and also working internationally on climate resilience at the U.S. Agency for International Development. She'll be telling us about an action you can take today related to one of the Orca Task Force recommendations on noise and disturbance. Over to you, Nora.
Thank you, Mindy, and thank you to Representative Lekanoff and Amy and Mindy for your strong leadership on these issues here in Washington. I'm going to share my slides here. So as we heard earlier, orcas need to be able to find salmon on the water, and noise and disturbance make that much more difficult, especially when salmon are scarce. One of the factors affecting noise and disturbance in the water is Navy training and testing, and there's something happening right now that gives us a chance to try to reduce those impacts that I would love to share with you. So the Navy has been doing training and testing in the waters of the Northwest for many years. Every several years, they have to get authorization for incidental take of marine mammals, because marine mammals can be affected in various ways from those training and testing exercises. And one of the activities that is increasing these days is their use of at-sea sonar testing. The Orca Task Force recognized the potential for adverse impacts from Navy training and testing, and particularly active sonar testing, noting that sonar can cause temporary hearing loss, behavioral reactions, masking of sounds, as well as stress in orcas. So to play the bingo game that Amy mentioned, that's Orca Task Force recommendation 25, was to try to coordinate more with the Navy to reduce those impacts on southern resident orcas. So what's happening right now is that the National Marine Fisheries Service has proposed a rule in response to the Navy's application for how much they would impact marine mammals with their activities over the next 7 years. In their final task force report last year, the Orca Task Force noted that the final decisions on this should eliminate impacts from additional exercises that might have the potential to adversely affect southern resident orcas, and that they should incorporate enhanced mitigation actions. So I will tell you what the proposed rule says and why it is of concern. So the Navy has proposed, and the National Marine Fisheries Service plans to approve 51 instances per year of level B harassment of southern resident orcas. Level B harassment includes things that would interrupt feeding, surfacing, nursing, breeding, etc., and particularly foraging for salmon. And so that could be 51 different orcas that are affected at some point during the year. It could be a fewer number of orcas that are affected multiple times. But that is 68% of the remaining population of southern resident orcas. Despite that large number, the National Marine Fisheries Service has made a preliminary determination of negligible impact. And I have a hard time believing that would be a negligible impact, and I don't think I'm alone in that. The Navy is also proposing to implement the same measures to try to protect marine mammals that they have done in the past, even though this impact level on the southern resident orcas is much higher than in the past. So their mitigation measures include things like having a person serving as a lookout on board the vessel, trying to see if they can see any marine mammals in the area so that they can stop if that happens. They are also supposed to stop at sea sonar testing if an orca comes within 200 yards, which is very close, and exercising caution when they move around to try to avoid collisions. And a lot of NGOs and state agencies have proposed a number of additional mitigation measures that could be put in place that would be more protective. Those could include things like getting better information about where the orcas are. There are new real-time alert systems that could be tapped into that would help them understand when they are approaching and not just having to rely on a human on the boat, being able to see them. And also talking about halting testing when the whales are further away, not letting them get so close before you shut off the sonar. It could also include things like seasonal closures, where you can sort of anticipate when the whales are going to be coming in. It's not totally predictable, but you could have closed areas to Navy exercises when that overlap is more likely. So there are a lot of NGOs will be commenting as well as others, and anyone may comment, and we hope that a lot of you will take a few minutes to submit a comment asking for more mitigation measures and a significant reduction in the incidental take of southern resident orcas. This is something that, while the state and the Orca Task Force and many others are doing a lot of work to try to increase salmon abundance and reduce noise, we would love for that not to be counteracted by additional Navy testing that could impact the southern residents adversely. So you have until July 17th, and I will make sure that this link to the comment form also shows up in the chat box. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Nora. We really appreciate that. And thank you all for the folks who have already typed in some questions for us. We're going to transition into that right now. I'm going to pose a couple of them to different panelists, and Erica, also invite you to look since it's multitasking at best. So I'm going to pull up my screen just for something else to look at while we're doing this. Actions you can take, including what Nora just mentioned related to Navy testing. One question comes in. I'm not sure who from our panelists could answer this, but mentions that what have we learned from the pandemic with less vessel traffic out there? Has there been a significant change in orca behavior? And I don't know if there's one of our panelists who would like to address that question. I know it's come up in a couple different places.
So I actually asked that specific question of folks in my shop, and we don't have the data in yet, so we can't really answer it at this moment. But what we do know is that we had fisheries were closed earlier this year. We didn't have salmon seasons at that time, so I'm not sure that would be a significant impact. And I know that the whale watching industry was not on the water either, so that may have had an impact. So there are on the recreational side, there may have been, but we don't have any data yet.
Great, thank you, Amy. Anybody else want to add to that?
This is Rep. Lekanoff. You know, normally you guys would see me in my backgrounds out there in Padilla Bay. I know we're looking for a scientific and a data answer, but just based on the local knowledge of the fishermen and the tribal fishermen and people who are on the shorelines observing it, there's been a lot more engagement they're seeing of the resources coming in, a lot more of the resources out in the waterways. And so they are feeling, just as people who are looking at the water every day and engaging on the shorelines, that they've seen more abundance of resources than they've normally seen. And I know local knowledge is also important to us. So taking it from the 40th, we were quite pleased to see Mother Earth just take a little bit of a break. And she took a deep breath, as did her resources and her animals out there.
Thank you both on that. Another question for anybody who wants to answer it is, was the task force able to interface with relevant British Columbian entities while drafting the recommendations? How many of the task force recommendations require receptivity and support from British Columbian authorities? Anyone want to take that?
Well, I could start, Mindy. Maybe you could pitch in as well. We had the consulate, the Canadian consulate, who's the man's name escapes me at this moment, sat with us at the task force so that we could be in close coordination with Canada. We have also worked closely with Canada on the vessel piece, and they have enacted measures like closed areas along the shoreline for orca. We are working really closely with Canada on the Fraser River landslide. I think it's called the Big Slide. It's having a significant impact on the Fraser River with incoming salmon and outgoing salmon. that slide almost fully blocked the Fraser River, and is a catastrophe, honestly, for the salmon on that river, which is a problem for orca. So we've been working very closely with them on that as well. So I'll stop there. Mindy, maybe you got some more, or Nora.
No, so we did have Bryce from the Canadian consulate joined us on that, and there were active conversations and a number of transboundary recommendations as well. The Canadians had a similar but different process underway on their part of the Salish Sea, and they came up with a number of recommendations. To be determined is their recommendations were sometimes inconsistent with ours. I mean, it's all good stuff, but the question is, what do we lean into together? And we both have our authorities on the US side of the border and in Canada as well. And I think there's some deep interest in trying to sync those up. So for example, on voter regulations, how do we make those common in both places, since a lot of voters do go back and forth across that particular border? So I think there's more work to do on syncing up our two countries on how to do that better. And I have a question for Nora that came in. Can you provide more detail on the mitigation measures that we should ask the Navy to implement?
Sure. I'll give a little more detail maybe on the getting earlier alerts about where the orcas might be. So one reason for that I mentioned is that people can't see super far on the water, but also some of the Navy's training and testing activities happen at night when it's even harder to see on the water. And there is what's called a whale report alert system that British Columbia has that partners like the Washington State Ferries and shipping are looking at how to expand it to Washington water. So that's one option. And then organizations like Orca Network also contribute to sightings networks here that are almost real time. So there are a lot of existing and emerging tools that the Navy could be using and changing their activities accordingly in a much more proactive way. And then, I think with the Orca Task Force requiring now that people go slow in boats, half a nautical mile from the orcas, that is, I think, what should be the absolute new minimum distance for shutting down things like sonar, but ideally it would be even further, because even the Navy's own estimates say that mid-frequency sonar can impact orcas at 16 kilometers. So a much bigger buffer zone is needed.
Great, thank you, Nora. Another question, I'm going back and forth between Q&A and chat, so apologies if we miss yours. But there was a question related to stormwater in Puget Sound, and that the Puget Sound Partnership had eliminated their stormwater program back in 2007, and what this person worked on. 2007, as you will recall, was the last recession. And my understanding is that was a required cut of state agencies at that time in order to balance the budget for the state of Washington. And just, I think, a recognition, and frankly, my worry as we go into a recession and a conversation in the next legislative session, there are a lot of core programs that are at risk of being cut right now, and there will be some really hard decisions made. So I think this is where it's going to be pretty important for people to be engaged in this process. It's going to be a lot of very difficult decisions. So I wasn't involved in the details of that particular cut on stormwater. Again, we know how important that is, but I think that's an example of something that is, incredibly important, but just could not be funded at the last recession. So that does not bode well, I think, for looking forward. So sorry, I don't have any better news on that. Okay, let's see. Question, I think, for you, Amy, on reducing traffic and noise is important. How will enforcement have more craft on the water and not contribute to the problem? Enforcement will be necessary. Folks don't understand the importance of keeping a distance from the whales.
Yeah, that's a good point. Our enforcement officers drive very fast vessels, and they drive them in to protect the orcas within the recommended. They don't stay out of that bubble. They do go into that bubble, particularly if that bubble has other boats in it. So for those limited times, I would say they are impacting the orca, but I think the greater good is that they keep people at the greater distance. They keep themselves at those distances as best they can in order to do their enforcement jobs. And I think one of the things that we've seen the research shows is that when enforcement is on the water, when they're with the whales, there's better behavior from all boaters. So I think it's critical that they're there and they are mindful of their own impact, and they do also have an impact because they're boats. So all of that is true.
Great, thank you. I'm also catching up. There was a question about having a more readable version of the task force recommendations than what probably came out teeny tiny and blurry on your screen. We'll figure out how to do that and make it available. We'll do a follow-up email for everyone who attended. So sorry for that. It's a lot of information to cram in one page. So we'll see what we can do. Amy, another question I think for you regarding seals and sea lions. Are the policies discussed taking the needs of the transient orcas into account? So transient seaweed marine mammals, bigs are the balance and counterproductive to adversely affect the transients as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would say that the conversation about the ecological impacts of the seals on both the salmon population as well as other orca populations is very lively right now. There was a recent, maybe in January or so, transboundary conference with Canada to look at the state of the science and what we know now. And I would say that the state of the science is not, it is not pointing us to a definite policy decision. We are still gathering the information, trying to understand how much of an impact the seals have on the salmon, and then trying to understand how much impact the bigs, any reduction in seals would have on bigs is just very active right now. And I think the state of the science is not, it's not in yet. We're still in the process. So still happening.
Great, thank you, Amy. There's a back and forth in the chat about the echo fish finders, echo locators, and then also a response from the person with better information than I think any of us could provide you. So we would refer you there. Couple mentioned that the JPOD was cited May 27th up in British Columbia, and no southern residents cited in the Salish Sea since April 16th, which is of course sad. Another kind of public service announcement I saw earlier. Let me see if I can find it again.
Hey, Mindy,
yeah.
While you're looking for that, I also have a little public service announcement that I just got on my email while you were wrapping up. One of the things that when we look at your, what we can do, one of them is support tribal treaty rights. And just this week, so when Grand Coulee Dam was installed back in the 30s, it immediately ceased all salmon into the upper watershed of the Columbia River. And there are tribes above the Grand Coulee Dam, like the Spokane tribe, that have not had a salmon run for 80 years. So what we just learned was that that there's a small group of salmon that have just been moved up and over the dam to the Coeur d'Alene tribe in order to support their cultural rights to catch salmon. It's a small number of fish that are being transported, but it's the beginning of a process that acknowledges the enormous loss of the Upper Columbia tribes, and that we have a vision for bringing salmon back to above Grand Coulee Dam. And it's a long vision, but at least we're starting to see it.
I think that's probably a good one to end on. A huge thank you to all of our panelists today, Amy Windrope and Representative Lekanoff, as well as Nora Nickham from the Seattle Aquarium. Clearly, there's more work to do on all of this. There's some really good work being done, but there's way more that does need to be done as well. So I think the more people are engaged in this, the better. We are some of the organizations working in this space. There are literally dozens of organizations, hundreds, I would imagine, actually, working at this in all levels of government, tribal to local, NGO community, the business community, fishing as well. So it really is going to take all of us pulling together. And it's one of those things that, salmon are in crisis. They've been in crisis for a while. And we really need to figure out, now that we're flexing our crisis muscles, we need to address this as well. So a huge thank you there. And with that, Erica, I think I'm turning it back to you for closing comments.
Yes, thank you so much to all of our panelists for joining us, and thank you to the audience for the over 100 people that joined us today. I know I learned so much. And just to kind of recap, the We Are Puget Sound campaign and book was created by Washington Environmental Council and Braided River, but also with over 100 different individuals and businesses and nonprofits and tribes that helped to bring this campaign to life. We've been doing different events all over Puget Sound, and over COVID-19, transitioning to doing more web events. So you can actually go watch all of the different web events that we've been doing since March on the Mountaineers Books YouTube channel. And if you're interested in getting a copy of the We Are Puget Sound book, if you use the code Time to Read, you'll actually receive a 25% discount on Mountaineers Books website. But you don't have to write that down. We'll send you a code along with a copy of the presentation so you can watch all of this again and just absorb some of the incredible information and resources from our panel speakers. And in the meantime, we just hope you're staying safe and finding ways to enjoy the outdoors and stay engaged and inspired with all of the work that we have ahead of us. So thank you very much and have a great rest of your day.